Thank you so much. A wonderful introduction, and it's just a great honor to be here. Um, that's actually an introduction a bit hard to live up to. So hopefully we will have a productive hour here together. This is joint work, as you mentioned, with Yorgos Petropoulos and Marshall Van Alstyne. So Yorgos is out of Bruegel, and then has come to us at MIT as a postdoc, and has really been doing some great work. Marshall and I have been colleagues for more than 20 years and have been on this journey really to try to understand first the micro foundations. That was kind of our early work, thinking about network effects, and then more broadly, how do firms leverage economic principles for their platform strategies. And then as with this work, more recently, we're moving into more of a policy and regulatory view. I suppose that might be the life cycle of an academic as they get older and grayer. So it's no secret that the big tech firms are getting increasingly scrutinized by regulatory authorities all over the world. These are older headlines, but I could have gone over the past month or so and would have easily found some similar ones. So I'd say across the world, the firms, because of their dominance, their market cap, their cash balance sheets, but more importantly, their ability to potentially foreclose competition, enter markets at will, and even their ability to, say, act as regulators of free speech and what gets put out to the public. I think quite correctly, governmental authorities are spending a lot more time trying to understand these firms. And in particular, we're talking about the largest technology firms and their place in our society. So the concerns are kind of spreading across the globe. And as you mentioned, the Digital Markets Act, I think that's a really important piece of legislation that tries to tackle what it means for society to interact with these very large firms that have so much power. I think what's fascinating is we're also seeing this come to play, not just in the European Union, not just in the US, but a lot is happening across the globe. And I want to kind of circle all the way back to that at the end. But on November 1st, for example, we have the China Personal Information Protection Law that will be coming into force. And that adds a new wrinkle for firms, and in particular for global supply chains. And we'll expand on that in a bit. So if you think and just step back, we've certainly had to deal with potential monopoly power really ever since the Industrial Revolution. And you had these enormous steel companies, transportation companies, oil companies, chemical companies that were able to fix prices, exclude competition, maintain power. And these are things then that we put in regulation and had entire agencies that were designed to try to detect potential monopoly power. And then usually ex post, that is after its observation, try to do something about it. And then at least in the US, we've had exceptions for innovation, superior products, superior business strategy, or even historical accident and path dependency. But by and large, if firms were engaging in collusion or predatory pricing or a number of other anti-competitive practices, they would draw the attention of the regulatory authorities. Now, what's so challenging, I think, with the technology firms is that by and large, they often don't fit the model of a traditional monopolist. And so here are a couple of examples. So one is that there are often free services. So for example, most of us consume Google search. We don't directly pay for it, but of course, it's being paid for. It's just on the other side of the market through advertising. And so, of course, consumers are paying for the services. They're paying for them through the price of the products and services that they purchase that are then ad sponsored. And so it's not really zero, but it makes it more difficult to observe. And so that takes some extra capacity and capabilities on the part of the economists and other analysts in regulatory authorities. I think another area that's challenging is the length at which these firms can operate at a loss, playing in effect a long game, and the degree to which they can internalize network effects. And when I talk about network effects, what I mean is the ability of one user to create value for another user by being on the system, and then the platforms are able to capture, in effect, that value and then make it available to other users. And we can kind of talk about that if people want to. And then the kind of third point here is these network effects can often provide significant protection and barriers to entry. And that's sort of the well-known winner take most or winner take all argument. And the way that works is if you think about, and you just stay in the metaphor of a two-sided market, any one of these firms that operates in such a market, they can offer value that's standalone. So the system would have some reason for a user to use it out of the box. And plenty of software services fit that description. But they might also have a same-side network effect. And I like to think of that as a collaboration ability, where the same type of users can interact with one another. And then, of course, they have a cross-side network effect that arises from the ability of the firm to orchestrate external participants, ecosystems, if you will, and then bring those to the system, and then provide that value to other users of the system. And so at launch, often you'll see firms focus on, say, just standalone value. And so that's a relatively even playing field in terms of competitive entry. But once they start to get going in terms of building big user bases, and then attracting big ecosystem communities, then the value proposition to any user coming to the system ends up increasing. And you can kind of see that. And this was some congressional testimony from a couple of years ago, but I think it ended up kind of capturing the issue. So for example, on social media, even when people quit, there aren't necessarily meaningful alternatives. So after the Cambridge Analytica scandal, many people quit, but only temporarily, and then came back to the system. And then I like this last, the second example. If I buy a Ford, in other words, an automobile, and I don't like it, well, I can buy another system. I can buy a Chevy or a BMW or a Daimler. But if I'm upset with a particular social media system, what's the equivalent product? And there may not be that much in a market. And so those are some of the competitive concerns. And then if you think and look at one particular firm, think about Amazon here. They're really large, obviously, in e-commerce, and the pandemic did exactly nothing to slow that down. They actually accelerated dramatically. They've started working in perishables, through their acquisition of Whole Foods. They have a really strong delivery chain, and they're actually vertically integrating now into the logistics services. Obviously, there's a whole content creation side, cloud computing, AI, machine learning as a service. And so there's dominance in niches, but of course, it's this kind of cross-pollination that I think really has people thinking hard. And as you mentioned, Volker, the kind of changes in the US in the FTC are interesting, and I think we'll have a lot more scrutiny on this. But there are some issues when you think about breaking some of these firms up. So I just want to give a kind of a data example. The data and its aggregation can have significant value. And so we know that, and we know that we can get lots of insights and generate services and products because we have access to data to train, and we can also do a much better job of matching products and services to specific users for their preferences. So in that sense, data can lead to lots and lots of improved welfare. The concern can be if you break some of these firms up and literally cleave the data in half, you may actually end up reducing value. And it kind of depends on where systems are on the learning curve. So for example, here, if you've got kind of two littler firms, smaller firms at the point B, it can be the case that the value that those firms can create from analyzing the data would be less than the total value of a larger firm simply because of the data learning curve. And so that's an area where you'd want to be careful as a regulator that you don't end up splitting firms and then destroying value. And that's one of the ways in which this ends up being pretty complex. But of course, the flip side is, as good friends would point out, it's that argument of, oh, it's too complex, what can we possibly do, that has slowed regulatory innovation, if you will, for many years. And so I'd say that this effort in this paper is trying to address that and create some regulatory innovation. And then, you know, as value creation moves outside of firms, and by that I mean we're orchestrating external participants, we're bringing them onto systems, that creates these kind of amazing value propositions for users. You know, platforms have the best and the most data. And so, for example, you know, Facebook and Google can do highly targeted advertising. They get the vast majority of the digital advertising spend. And at least in the US, there are areas of dominance, as I mentioned earlier. And then I think that last bullet, the ability to observe transactions on the system and then integrate into the highest profit sectors is a concern, and one that I think needs to be addressed. So lots and lots going on in this space in terms of studies and commissions. It seems as though a new one will get published, you know, every month, documenting the harm and, you know, what is that, gatekeeper firms excluding other actors, potentially engaging in mergers and acquisitions to reduce competition. There may be reduced quality products, such as poor privacy protection, simply because the value proposition that arises from network effects allows them to degrade some of the offerings in other dimensions of the product or service. And I think the next bullet is particularly important. This ex post enforcement doesn't appear to work. It takes nearly forever. And so you can think about some of these competition cases dragging on for as long as a decade. And then at the end of it all, there's a fine. And it might be, you know, some amount of money that seems like a lot, $1 billion here, 100 million there, but it doesn't seem to change any behavior. And all of the conditions that kind of drove the intervention or the scrutiny in the first place may well have changed. And so as a result, I'd say there's a lot of interest, and you'll have seen this in the DMA, saying, well, if ex post sort of waiting to observe bad behavior doesn't work, then it makes a lot more sense to perhaps go ex ante and start to publish lists of things that are prohibited or allowed. And that's actually in our commentary, a different work. We had this commission and we put forth a report. We ended up kind of proposing a blacklist of things that are clearly should be prohibited, a white list of things that, you know, in terms of behavior, likely were fine, and then a gray list of things that could be problematic, and then you'd want to have some sort of a review before that behavior was allowed. And then we'll drill in a minute and consider that in the context of mergers and acquisitions. So specific to this paper, we were really interested in what actually happens. So we got a data set put together and used sources like Crunchbase, Wikipedia. There's a project at Yale. Um, the Microsoft Investor Relations acquisition history was a really good resource, and was very fortunate to have Adai and Nicole, two students at Dartmouth, along with Yorgos Petropoulos, who really did the heavy lifting on assembling this data set. And it was a lot of work because they had to go essentially hand build it. And then figure out, well, what's the price of the acquisition, if that was even disclosed? What's the acquired firm? What was its specialization, the industry it belongs to? And then I think that third bullet is really interesting. What's the motivation? And we'll see that there's kind of a different pattern of motivations for acquisition by firm. And then how was the acquired firm integrated into the business model? Was it absorbed, or was it operating as an independent player? And then finally, was the acquisition a technology transfer play, a talent acquisition, sort of called an acqui-hire, or some flavor of both? And then if you kind of think about the antecedent to this, why were so many of these M&As not stopped? And I'd say that, at least in the US, there's been a really high tolerance for, at least 40 years for mergers and acquisitions to take place as long as consumer prices don't go up. But of course, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, how are technology consumers paying if the services are free? Well, of course, they're paying with their data. And there's a really neat paper by some colleagues from MIT on accounting for the value of new and free goods in the digital economy. And it turns out that there's enormous consumer benefit. And this is important because that consumer benefit doesn't necessarily get measured in gross domestic product for certain countries. And so there's this whole area of economic activity that may be getting undercounted. But that's sort of a separate issue. But it dovetails to this in as much as we know that, first of all, there's value being created, but also there's payment taking place. So it's not really true that consumer prices don't increase if there's concentration. They just increase in terms of whoever's paying for the advertising, and that gets passed on to consumers. In the EU and also in the US, you can see, and so this is by Jenny, another paper in this special issue that this paper appears in, talking about the limited number of cases, and there isn't particularly large impact on the behavior. So you'd have to say that whatever was there has been pretty ineffective in terms of competition law enforcement. So let's kind of step back then and just take a look at what the firms actually have been up to, at least in terms of their frequency and patterns of these mergers and acquisitions. So if we just look at the total, we found 855 in our sample. And so we've got the Apple. Obviously, the firms have different start dates, so you would expect these numbers to be different. And then Microsoft, since it's 1991, and then we've got Amazon since 98, Google since 2001, Facebook since 2005. Interestingly, even the older firms such as Microsoft, you look at that and you say, well, they're still running at a pretty high rate per year. So you can see that Google and Microsoft are kind of the clear outliers here in terms of their activity. And then we went and looked at just the frequency counts over years, and you can see that period over really almost the last decade, there's been quite a lot of activity. But I think the interesting one in terms of this data is really around the motivations. And so if you look at Google, we'd say, well, for the most part, they were looking at technology transfer as well as some hiring. If you look at Facebook, there was quite a bit of hiring and talent acquisition. If you look at Amazon, there was quite a bit of technology transfer. And so you can actually see different strategies play out by the different firms. And some of that may represent simply their age and the rates of their growth. So for example, Facebook was scaling rapidly, perhaps during the years of its acquisitions, and so was trying to bring talent on as quickly as possible. So you'd have to dig in a bit more to get to the root causes, but it's still interesting, I think, to see the different patterns. And so if we think about a typology of the mergers and acquisitions, that can help us think through, what we might choose to do, if anything, about those M&As. So we broke this down into 4. So the first here is some kind of complementary functionality that can help the company provide more efficient service related to core business. So that sort of adds to, if you will, the main kind of platform function. On the other hand, you can also add in products and services in the vertical value chain, so we can stack things on top or below. We can start to have substitutable or competing services that could potentially reduce competition. And then the last one, as I mentioned, is this acquisition of human capital, either employed by the target firm or some sort of user base that's orchestrated by the target firm. So these raise different sets of concerns that we try to march through. So one of them is this kind of dynamic concern. Are we seeing acquisitions that are designed to prevent entry into a space? So this is this kill zone effect. And that's been documented primarily in the pharmaceutical space. But we can envision and give some examples in the paper of how that could play out broader in the technology industries. And we can have these horizontal concerns where we might end up kind of leading to competitive bottlenecks and then distortion of competition upstream and have market foreclosure. So then we say, well, of course, we have to step back and think about who we're talking about here. And so in the DMA, there's quite a bit of focus on this notion of a gatekeeper. And so to provide an example of what that can look like, we think of this star network with the platform as the center node. And so then the value that the platform brings to the ecosystem can indicate what the actors and what the sort of other firms in orbit, how much they depend upon it. So it's a gatekeeper if the platform is highly, if the other firms are highly dependent upon the platform. So first best, if you could get access to the data, would be to assess a platform as gatekeeper by looking at the number of interactions among the users that it facilitates. So that's sort of interactions from user to platform, but critically, interactions user to user. Those aren't necessarily transactions, but they frequently are some exchange of value. So it would be good if we could have some kind of regulation that would report the interactions that are facilitated sort of at different points and in the temporal space at different points in time. And then you'd have to know, well, how do you believe that? So you could have some sort of embedded auditor. And that idea of embedding is an important one because you'd like to know that the platforms are actually adhering to their own governance principles. And there's got to be some way to test that because that's another area that you could either have sort of pro welfare enhancing activity, or you might end up having things that reduce welfare. So if we can't get that, and you frequently won't be able to get this kind of granular interaction data, the second best measure that you could imagine would be the user base of the platform and the different types of users, and you could categorize those and then bucket them to see if indeed a particular platform is a gatekeeper. And then in the DMA, and I think this is a useful distinction, you've got this notion of the consumer side gatekeepers, and those are the big tech firms like, and think Google when we use search, and that'll have sort of a user base and a set of transactions that are orders of magnitude higher than what we might observe in the B2B space. But I think the B2B space is one that's really important to keep our eye on, because that's where an awful lot of investment is going. And we're seeing a huge amount of interest, especially in incumbent industrial firms, for a variety of reasons, that are making investments in that space. And then the questions, of course, are we going to see the emergence of the same kind of dominant firms? Or in the B2B space, are there reasons that you would expect due to industry-specific conditions, vertical, sort of localization conditions that would drive less concentration and perhaps the emergence of specific industry-focused gatekeeper platforms? And so I think we're going to have to essentially be flexible on that point and keep an eye on it. So in the paper, we propose 4 policy responses to try to think about, well, what do you do to try to mitigate the potential harm while maintaining the benefits? Because let's be clear, not all mergers and acquisitions necessarily cause harm. There are plenty of times when it would make perfect sense. And so one example is if you've got external participants that are providing services that are being consumed by the vast majority of users of a system, then it often makes sense to actually absorb that functionality into the core platform. So in effect, purchase it or replicate it in order to provide that functionality to all users. And in the paper, we leverage the end-to-end principle to try to essentially explain why it is that the kind of low variety, high frequency sets of functionalities need to be in the core platform. And then you use the ecosystem to provide the kind of highly variable but lower frequency applications, services, products. And that's one of the kind of the magic of the platforms in terms of their ability to create value. So now let's kind of zero in on this data issue, because I think that's a really important one. So we spent a fair bit of time in the paper trying to think about what does it mean if you've got one of these enormous platform firms. They have control over the data and the customers, and the customers' data are kind of embedded in the system. So what we end up proposing is this notion of an in situ data right. And in effect, we're looking at the users, and those users can be consumer users or industrial users, but let's think about consumer users. It may make sense in some cases to give them portability, but not always. So let's take a look at that. So if we think about the GDPR and US Congress, they've talked about data portability, and as Volker mentioned in the setup, that may be a good thing, but it may not always have as much impact as we think. And so here are some kind of challenges. One is that when you move data out of a system, you lose context. And so if you think particularly about a social network, if you're making a response to somebody else's post or activity, your response can be downloaded, but you don't know what the response is corresponding to. And so in effect, you've lost context. So that's kind of one challenge with data portability, is that you're really operating in a much more complex data space. And if you take the data out of that system that belongs to one particular individual, that's fine, but it doesn't necessarily mean nearly as much or be nearly as valuable as it would be if it was in context with the other users of the system. The second one I think is a really important one, because you've got this notion of directory data, such as my name, my date of birth, where I live, where I work, that tends to change, slowly or not at all. And then you have this kind of flow data or state data, such as my location at any given moment. If you port data that would be rapidly changing, then it ends up being reduced in value. And then the other issue is, or rather a third issue is, as we port data out of these systems, then you've got more risk of losing the data or having it exposed, because you have to defend them not just where the platform is holding the data, but then all the different ports that you've got. And once you get it out to a third party, you've got essentially the potential of resharing to fourth, fifth, X parties. And then another issue is, and a salient in the case of sort of thinking about greenhouse gas emissions and sort of excess investment in cloud systems, we may end up having redundant infrastructure. I haven't done the analysis on that, so I don't know the magnitude of that potential, but it's possible, and we certainly know that data storage, data computation, data transmission is an industrial process at this point. You literally see data centers located next to hydroelectric power systems in order to get access to relatively low carbon and low cost electric power. And then I think this goes back to this notion of context, is it's hard to act upon data that is not contextually relevant. And then finally, you've got this really, really important competition issue, which is if you start with a small amount of data that was ported out of one of these gatekeeper platforms, you're starting with small network effects. So you kind of go back to that point I made earlier, which is that these user bases, as they grow, then create network effect benefit that provides value to users, and that makes it really difficult for entrants to come in and allow for the same value proposition. So if you don't have the benefit from the network effect, then you don't have much motivation to go through the effort. And I should have another bullet on here, which is that often these systems are not particularly user-friendly, and we've seen this in the world of medical data and healthcare data, where a number of firms have kind of taken a crack at trying to get consumers to download all of their healthcare data and then aggregate it into one portal. And of course, those were miserable failures because that assumed a level of technological literacy among the users that simply wasn't there, and really high transaction costs. So there are a lot of reasons why data portability, you might look at that and go, that may not be the best answer. And that was why we ended up stepping back and saying, well, if that's not working all that well, what might? So what we end up doing is thinking of a regulation that essentially requires platforms to open the infrastructure to competitors, and that allows you to use the data in situ, in effect, where it's collected. And so the users have rights to data, and then they can grant permission for that third-party potential competitor entry. And in effect, I guess the punchline would be that you bring algorithms to data instead of data to algorithms. Now, in a small way, you see little bits of this in the Payment Services Directive 2, where you open up a little bit in those cases so that third parties can take actions on bank accounts, in effect, so initiate payments. It's not a perfect example of in situ, but it is sort of the idea that you're starting to provide infrastructure that allows third parties to act on behalf of one of the users that's affiliated with a larger firm. We also have this notion of the Open Algorithms Project. And so if you compare some of these issues, well, in terms of the context problem, if you bring algorithms to the data, then context is preserved. And so the data provided by friends and third parties remains intact. I think critically, you've got the second point is bring algorithms to the data, then you always have the most recent state and you always have the updates. And I think the third point is important because you have this single point of access, and that allows you to invest in appropriate security in one place. And it's certainly easier to trace who has access to the application programming interfaces than it would be to try to trace data leakages that could be due to second, third, fourth party leaks. Now, that third point is actually pretty interesting because you can envision smaller firms that would want to allow for in situ access, but might not necessarily have the infrastructure to do so. And so you could envision then an intermediary coming in and an entire sort of new industry to provide this infrastructure. We can also curtail secondary uses. It's not possible to reshare the data if you don't have it. You've got better use of existing infrastructure and, of course, economies of scale. And then I think the last one is worth sort of sitting on for a minute. The chicken and egg problem is really severe for startups, but if you're able to provide data in context, then you can actually leverage the additional data from, for example, if in the social media system, my first or second degree contacts, and you have to figure, well, where do you draw the line there? And so there's certainly plenty of technical detail to work out, but you should have access to much more data than you would if you just said, hey, the only thing you have to work with is what you were able to convince users to port out of a system. And that's sort of your seed data to try to create some value from. So to give a little bit of an illustration of how this might work, we've got this sort of suppliers or retailers, app developers, advertisers, and they have kind of limited ability potentially to reach users outside the gatekeeper and vice versa. So we have an entrant that would like to come into the system. Users say, well, my data is all in the gatekeeper, so I have to provide consent. And then that entrant can then bring the algorithms inside the gatekeeper's kind of infrastructure, and then train the algorithms essentially to get the weights that would then allow them to develop some kind of product or service that's tailored to that specific user. So that's what it would look like in this kind of horizontal dimension. And then vertically, you can envision suppliers that would like to get better access to data. And then similarly, they can end up going in and bringing their algorithm into the broader data pool for analysis. And then that ends up kind of creating a much more level playing field than always having to play by the access rules that the gatekeepers themselves establish. Because after all, it is the user's data that we're talking about here. It's not necessarily the platform's data. It's just that there's no efficient way for users to share that currently. And so that's the kind of key problem that we're trying to address. We have some additional policy proposals, and those are looking at new rules ex ante, so not waiting around, but to try to think, well, what would requirements be? So certainly on upstream competitors, you'd want to have some kind of firewall and verify that that was in place in order to maintain equality of access for upstream competitors. You'd like to have objective and enforceable criteria for matching and ranking. And in particular, this is the case where you might have a platform that is also a supplier in its own market. And then you'd like to know, well, are they preferencing their own supply to the detriment of other suppliers? Or is there a reason why they show up first, their own supply in search results and in matching to potential consumers? So, that's the area where you've got to have some kind of way to do tests, collect data, verify that this is a fair fight, if you will, on the market, or is it just self-preferencing? And then we'd also look at a certain set of notification thresholds. Are there things that have to be approved ahead of time? And then who has the burden of proof? Is it always the competition authorities that say, no, that was anti-competitive? Or instead, are there some situations where you'd say, well, that looks like it's likely to be anti-competitive, but we could envision some economies of scope or scale reasons why that might actually increase consumer welfare, but show us. I mean, that burden of proof then sits upon the gatekeeper platform as opposed to the competition authorities. And then, the fourth one is an interesting one. An M&A happens at a point in time, but of course, these are all dynamic markets. And so you would like to know what the likely trajectory of the market is, and then do some counterfactual analysis to say, well, if we allow for this merger, what's likely to play out over time? And would there have been some better merger that we might have waited out for, or no merger that would have actually resulted in a higher welfare? And so I think because of the dynamics of the markets, it's really hard when you're just dealing with a point in time. So you'd like to see a more dynamic kind of framework to think about the counterfactual. And then if you kind of just step back and say, well, from principles, what would you really want to ensure? Well, certainly trust and security, compatibility, some kind of dispute resolution mechanism, certainly data protection and encryption. You don't want to prohibit, or rather you don't want to allow for exclusivity and access to data, some kind of non-discrimination clause. And then I think the last point is none of this is stable. These industries have clearly been changing incredibly fast. And so we should recognize that, and that requires, sort of a continuous, not even periodic, updating evaluation of the market conditions, of the industry conditions. And so what I want to leave you with is just some further work, and then we'll have a few minutes for Q&A, and look at my contact information is there. I'd love to hear from people, so we can continue, offline, as it were. But I think a really fascinating thing that's happening in the regulatory space is coming, and it got accelerated in the disputes of the previous U.S. administration with China, but we're seeing a lot of kind of data nationalism and data residency requirements that are now getting forced on industry players. And so the question for firms that are multinational, so think about some of the really big, say, firms in Europe, in Germany in particular, that are operating both in the East, in China, in Asia, in Africa, and in the US, that's a really tough conundrum, because you have to say, well, now what do I do in terms of a technical architecture to accommodate multiple geographic residency requirements? If this digital decoupling is real, and you buy the idea that aggregation of data creates real benefits, as we were kind of looking earlier, which was the whole driver behind let's allow for in situ instead of fragmenting all of this. What does that mean in terms of kind of regional decoupling? And then what does that imply for the business models? So I think there's just an awful lot going on in this space. So it's certainly a fascinating time to be an observer and to some small degree a participant. So with that, Volker, we've got about 10 minutes. So why don't I just stop right here?